Americans for Safe Access is celebrating our 23rd anniversary. For over 2 decades, we've brought medical cannabis stakeholders together to meet the immediate needs of patients while addressing knowledge, policy, and regulatory gaps, clearing the way for a national medical cannabis framework that serves all patients. What you may not know is that ASA has been women-led ever since I founded the organization in 2002. So for our 23rd anniversary, I've created this series where I've interviewed women who have taught me everything I know about medical cannabis. If you haven't met my next guest, Gillian, you're in for a treat. Gillian is the executive director of CANNRA, and in a way is sort of filling the role of the federal government, bringing state regulators together to learn from each other, explore best practices, and she's always looking out for medical cannabis patients and trying to make sure that we stay a part of the conversation. Hi, Gillian.
Hi, Steph. Thanks for
How are
having me
you?
on.
Of course. Thanks for taking some time to come in my little Women Who Crush space.
Love it.
This has been it's been an amazing project, an opportunity for me to highlight and show folks all the amazing women that I work with and kind of get a peek behind the scenes. So thank you. I know you're super busy, so I really appreciate your time.
Happy to do it.
All right, let's get started. Why don't you just start off with telling us how you found your way into cannabis world?
Yeah, so I have training in public health and have worked in drug policy for a while. I was working in tobacco prevention and control, working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, trying to figure out how to help people who wanted to quit smoking to be able to do that for commercial tobacco products. And I decided to write my dissertation when I was doing my PhD while working at CDC on young adults who use cannabis and tobacco products. And I was really interested. It was a mixed method study, but I was really interested in the reasons for using both. And was it that both had some sort of additive effect? Was it that they were trying to quit smoking cigarettes and using cannabis as an alternative? Was it that they couldn't use cannabis because of stigma and they were using tobacco products instead? So I did this study. A lot of my data collection was in Washington State. I did this study to try to understand young adults' relationship to these two substances. And it was right around the time that Washington and Colorado were legalizing. And so I then became very interested in policy, got some special permission to sort of be rogue in the field on a contract with CDC, a fellowship with CDC, to try to understand what cannabis legalization meant for public health
Mhm.
and to understand the entire spectrum, not just the risks, which is maybe where public health traditionally went, but also what could be the benefits to social justice, to patients, to a whole host of public health issues that often weren't brought to light. So I did that for a number of years, worked with state health officials, helped them figure out how to collect data and how to collect data more broadly than just traditional public health data sources. And then the vaping lung injury outbreak happened. And that's really when I started to hear from regulators. I was convening public health officials who wanted to talk about this issue, and they started bringing their regulators on and saying, our regulator wants to talk about this too. And I saw an interest in regulators in really thinking about public health and consumer safety in a new light. So a couple of regulators from that group pulled me aside and said, we've been trying to convene regulators. We know you've been convening public health officials. We want you to come do that for us and help us stand up the Cannabis Regulators Association. So it took a few years to do that, but we did it. And I'm really excited with what we've created, really excited by the turn I've seen in policy as well on the ground, where there is this focus that wasn't there in the same way on day one for a lot of reasons, but there's now this focus on consumer safety, on trying to figure out how to get safe products to people who need to use them, who want to use them, et cetera. And I feel like that's really at the forefront for basically every state now. They all have different, other focal points, but consumer safety's really come into focus. And that was my goal and what I had spent a lot of my career working on. So that's how I ended up here, and I haven't looked back.
No, I love that. And it's been such a blessing because, before, we always were meeting with regulators one by one and, just the peer conversations, we weren't able to foster those. Obviously, as a stakeholder group, they were always a little wary. And I think, regulators, I've always said this, they have the hardest job of anyone in the stakeholders group because they don't have their own, they don't have control over the budget. They're often given this like impossible task, like regulate cannabis, right? And we've tried to provide resources where we can. But they're also the public face of these cannabis programs. So if anything goes wrong, they're the ones who get yelled at by all the stakeholders.
Yeah.
And then they often get, dragged in front of the state legislature, and yelled at again. And so I just think the fact that they have a place to talk about this and get support is so valuable. So I'm very
Yeah.
appreciative.
We often joke that CANNRA is, a lot about learning and sharing and trying to figure out the path forward, but also a lot of therapy because it is a really hard job that regulators have. And I think a lot of people don't understand that regulators are really the implementers, right? A lot of times they're getting what was given to them by a state legislature and they're trying to make the best of that and listen to all the voices in the room around how to move forward with that. But when there are fundamental disagreements with what they've been given, a lot of times people aren't going back to their state legislature, they're going to their regulator. So, civics 101, there's
Right.
statutes and rules, and, sometimes it's the statutes that need to be modified, not the rules. So they've got a tough job, and I'm glad that we can help them support each other because I think that's the best way forward.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting. We have the State of the States report where we grade all of the states and always get those to regulators to look over. And it's interesting because most regulators get back to us and they say, no, no, we're not doing that. Don't give us points for that. Because they really want to make sure that the state legislature knows, right, that if they want them to do that, they're going to have to, add that in. In this space, what has been the biggest surprise for you, like coming into to regulating a Schedule One substance? Like what has been something that you didn't expect would be a challenge or something that was maybe easier than you thought it would be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much that I could say to answer that question. This is a faster moving space than I ever could have imagined. And I came out of tobacco control policy,
Right.
which I also felt like, I was in that space just as vape products were coming onto the scene. And I
Right.
felt like that was a fast moving space, but nothing compares to cannabis. The industry is really innovative. The needs and demands of consumers and public health and patients are also dynamic and fast moving. And honestly, science is and policy is behind all of that. And so that makes for a really tough space. I think another learning, I came into this work with regulators thinking, with my background in research, there must be some areas where we can harmonize across states. Like, there's no reason that states should be doing, totally different things on lab testing, for example. And I think my realization is that that is much harder to accomplish than I ever imagined because of the way policy is being made. So harmony doesn't just come from having a group of regulators be able to come together and say, we think this is best practice. It
Right.
comes from having state legislatures all be able to row in the same direction and pass the same sorts of policies. And that is, nearly impossible, which is one of the reasons why, we're not an advocacy group at CANNRA. We aren't advocating for any policy, but we have been vocal that we need more federal engagement. And one of the areas where I think every state would like to see federal engagement is in setting some minimum standards, because that would create some harmony at a base level. So, I mean, those are two things that come to mind that were, surprising, more challenging than I expected, but it's a privilege every day to get to work with the regulatory folks that I get to work with. They are the hardest working public servants I've ever been around, and I've spent my entire career working in and around government. They really have the best intentions, even though it may not always be covered that way by the media or seen that way, on social media. They have their hearts in the right place and are trying to move things forward.
Yeah, no, I don't think very many people really think about what it means to regulate a substance that is illegal federally. I mean, it is, there's so many just natural parts of our for businesses that are completely off limits, right? Transportation, our lab systems, like the normal, assets that public health have, that are just not an option. People have had
Yeah.
really it's like reinventing the wheel 50 times.
Yeah, and states don't have the fortune of economies of scale, neither does the industry, but I mean, every state has had to create, as I've said, since my day one on this job, every state's had to create their own mini FDA, their own mini EPA, their own mini SBA, all these federal agency acronyms that states have had to try to create internally because they can't use structures across states and they don't have support from federal agencies in the traditional way. So it does greatly impact the work. I think we're seeing states find ways to navigate around that. I think lab testing is an interesting space to look at. We're in the very early days. State labs said, we don't want to be part of this. This is a Schedule 1 substance. We could lose our federal funding. And so that's why we don't have state labs be the primary testers of cannabis. We have this third-party lab structure. But over time, we've seen states both identify an essential need to have state labs that are part of the system, and we've seen some states be able to create that. And now we have a number of states with reference labs where it's a state funded or state run lab that's able to come online and not do all the testing. The capacity is not there for that, but be a resource to the state to mitigate discrepancies in testing, to help with investigations. Oregon just released a fantastic report on testing their reference lab did on cannabis and hemp products in their market to look at what's the potency inflation and where is it happening and what are the contaminants and what do we see in these products when we look at them in our own public health lab. So I think that's an example where states are figuring out how to be nimble, but it's a heavy ask of a state infrastructure to basically form all of the components of a federal infrastructure because we don't have that at play.
And I think that there's on the other side of that, I mean, this is really, medical cannabis and now adult use, this is really the most exhaustive use of our laboratories of democracy that I can think of, right? Where, I mean, I can't think of any other policy issue that's really stretched sort of the limits of that. But I think there's also some opportunities that we can learn from in other arenas because we're doing, these very state focused, even the testing, we're learning more about soil, that we don't even see in our foods right now, that I think there will be a contribution of looking at, how we can share that information. But I think, again, the what I've seen also in the area of regulators is just the different skills that they've had to hire within, like you said, like these are all these agencies. So, how do you even start from day one with HR? I've been asked to come in and to work with regulators just to figure out who they should be hiring. Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't see one model that works. There are lots of models that work, but I think there are some commonalities over the last, 5 to 7 years, especially. Regulators have realized they need to have scientists on staff, right? They need to have data people on staff. It's helpful to have access to a chemist, right? Or a toxicologist, which not all regulatory agencies have had, but I think they're each figuring out in their own way how to get those resources. And there are definitely some model states that from day one really have worked well across agencies. I mean, cannabis is unique in that it touches so much across government. I could make a case that, 8 different federal agencies have some reason to be engaged. The same is true at the state level. Colorado, I think, comes to mind as a state that from day one really had their governor say, regardless of what you think about this personally, this is the will of our voters. And so we want you to be engaged, from all these different state agencies and be part of a work group and work together. And they've more or less been able to uphold that, even as we've seen the market change and hemp products come online. And my cat is making an
Yeah, it's like
we're gonna have to cut that out. I can answer that one again. I'm gonna have to put her in. I'm gonna have to put her in a room. Steph, hang on.
She was upstaging. That was cute. Oh, but now we get to see
Totally.
the back of your haircut.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that was cute. I like the back of your haircut. I didn't see it
Oh,
before.
thank you.
I thought
Okay.
you had it like tied back. No, that's really cute.
Okay, so where should I restart? Sorry.
So no, I might
Um,
leave a little bit of that in. Oh, it's cute.
okay.
Yeah, so you were just wrapping up about Colorado,
Oh,
really
yeah, I'll start there.
agencies.
I'll
Yeah.
start there. Yeah, I think Colorado is a great example, one of the first states to do this, but a state whose governor said from the very beginning, we're going to work together as a state to meet all the needs of this new marketplace, this new space that's being created. And so they've had, cross-agency work groups that have continued to meet have been especially important as the market's evolved and as we've seen hemp products come online, and they've got a really collaborative approach. So I think they're an example, but again, we've seen states take their own way of doing this and figure out how to get the expertise they need. The resourcing, though, in states continues to be a challenge. And I think we have seen as time has moved on, there are some states where legislatures have said, okay, we've been at this for a while. Maybe you don't need all these funds. Maybe we can take back some of these funds that your regulatory agency has to allocate elsewhere. And I think there's some danger in that because, this is still a new and dynamic space, and we need to keep the right resources in place so that regulatory agencies and other state agencies can serve, patients, public health, consumers, the industry in the way that's needed to do this right. So I hope that regulatory agencies will continue to be well resourced for the work they do. It's really important.
Yeah, no, it makes me really nervous to see, and it's always political. It usually has nothing to do with what's happening in the agency, but people saying, "Oh, well, let's fund something else in the state with these proceeds." I'm like, wait a second, we still don't have safe products. Like, you can't, fund our schools while you're selling people, products that aren't safe. So it's definitely, yeah, a very scary future to see people they just see that bottom line of the cash coming in and want to disperse it other places. But what's interesting, you said, Colorado, you're talking about the adult use, when the adult use started. And, before that, before we got to that point with medical, it was another state that started off with a criminal exemption was the only protections that patient advocates had to fight to get access. And, right before adult use passed, we were actually we finally convinced the state legislature that we needed to work with all of those agencies. And so it was a nice transition, for adult use. And I think that's been sort of and I know I was actually at a meeting talking to a lot of regulators about sort of the future of medical cannabis. And it's definitely been a hard pill to swallow for a lot of patients that we really held the door open for adult use, that we figured out a lot of, how to not do it, how to do it right. And, that there just isn't sort of room for both consumer groups. And I think, our point of view at ASA is that maybe this means it's time for a national program. That's always been our goal. And, I think state regulators are going to play a big part in informing, federal policies. And I know you have been doing some weighing in on federal policies through CANNRA. And sort of maybe as our final thought, you just tell us a little bit about how you see state and federal interacting as we move forward.
Yeah, I have to comment on sort of your remarks about patients being left behind. States are very aware of the need for medical programs or ways to protect patients as well, which is one of the reasons I'm really excited for the discussion that we're going to really start to have, I think, at the CANNRA meeting in June in Denver about what is medical cannabis and how do we figure out ways through regulation to protect patients and get them safe product wherever they may be. Because I think in this dynamic marketplace where patients have a lot of places to go to access product, it's not always the regulated spaces. And so there's a need to kind of revisit that. And I think federal policy will play a role as well. We've seen federal legalization of hemp, but cannabis is still Schedule 1. That's created a lot of problems for regulators when literally the same 100 milligram Delta 9 THC brownie is regulated by one set of rules if it's marijuana and one set of rules if it's hemp. So we've got to figure out how to bring those together. I think, CANNRA doesn't advocate or lobby for policy, but there's a lot of interest from regulators in what's going to happen with the Farm Bill and kind of what we're going to see come out of Congress in terms of potential for federal engagement in the hemp landscape, where we don't have a federal regulator for finished products. And that's created a gap that states are trying to meet, and they're meeting it in their own way, which is creating more heterogeneity. And we definitely need a federal presence there. So we're interested in watching that space as well federally.
Love it. Well, thank you again so much for spending some time with me, and I'll just hand it back over if there are any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with.
Yeah, I think, you asked before this conversation, which I loved, kind of what my wisdom and guidance would be in this space. And I come at this as a researcher, and every day I think that there's some value in that, because I feel like we need to listen to each other more. We need to hear all the data points. It's important for everybody to have their true north, to have their morals and ethics and boundaries, but also to not have that conflict with a willingness to learn. Because I think, once we're willing to learn and even to have our minds changed, then we can find places where there might be common ground and we can find new approaches. And so that's how I approach my work, trying to understand every data point, talk to everybody who has a perspective in this space, understand their context and their realities, and then bring that back and try to think about what does that mean for the federal landscape, and how can we try to take all those data points and make something that makes sense. So I wish there were more folks in this space that were doing that. I know there are lots of people who've been advocating in this space for decades, and it's easy for everybody to get in their corner. But I think that that's hard for regulators, I will say, when everybody's in their corner and they're coming to talk to their regulator and they're only in their corner, the regulator's left trying to make sense of it. The sooner and the more we can get advocacy groups and industry and public health and research and science together to share their data points in the same space and really listen to each other, I think the sooner we'll have more regulatory certainty on the ground and a clearer path forward.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Gillian.
Thanks for having me, Steph. It's great chatting.
Of course.